At 4:17 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time on Tuesday, Russian Navy vessels executed a coordinated maneuver in international waters just south of the Bosporus Strait that fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Black Sea. What happened in those 72 minutes represents the most significant shift in regional military dynamics since the outbreak of the Ukraine conflict in February 2022. And what nobody is telling the world is that Turkey, the nation that has controlled access to the Black Sea for nearly a century through the Montreux Convention, just watched its strategic leverage evaporate. The Russian flotilla consisted of 6 vessels, 3 Admiral Grigorovich-class frigates, 2 improved Kilo-class submarines, and 1 Ivan Gren-class landing ship. The frigates alone carry a combined total of 72 caliber cruise missiles with ranges exceeding 2,500 kilometers, capable of striking targets as far west as Paris or as far south as Cairo. The submarines, operating submerged at depths exceeding 300 meters, deployed to patrol stations that effectively create an underwater blockade line running from the Crimean Peninsula to the Turkish exclusive economic zone. The landing ship, displacing 6,000 tons and capable of transporting 13 main battle tanks or 36 armored personnel carriers, positioned itself in a holding pattern that signals Russia's ability to project amphibious power anywhere along the Black Sea coastline within hours. Turkey's response was immediate, but revealed a fundamental powerlessness that analysts have been warning about for 18 months. The Turkish Navy dispatched 4 vessels to monitor the Russian movements, but monitoring is not deterring. The Turkish ships maintained a distance of 12 nautical miles from the Russian formation, never crossing into what Moscow has designated as its operational security perimeter. That 12-mile buffer represents submission, not sovereignty. When a NATO member state watches a geopolitical adversary establish de facto control over international waters adjacent to its territorial seas and responds by maintaining a respectful distance, the world is witnessing a power differential that cannot be obscured by diplomatic language. The economic implications cascade immediately into energy markets. The Black Sea serves as the transit route for approximately 8 million barrels per day of crude oil and petroleum products, representing roughly 4% of global seaborne oil trade. Natural gas pipelines running beneath these same waters deliver 3 billion cubic meters annually to European markets. Russia's new naval posture, which military analysts describe as an area denial strategy designed to control maritime choke points without formally closing them, creates uncertainty premiums that immediately appeared in futures markets. Brent crude prices rose $37 per barrel in the 16 hours following the Russian deployment. Natural gas futures for European delivery spiked 2%. Make sure to subscribe to Dr. Elena Harris right now and hit that notification bell, because what is unfolding in the Black Sea is moving faster than traditional news cycles can track. The next 72 hours will determine whether Turkey attempts to reassert its historical role as gatekeeper of these waters, or whether Ankara accepts a subordinate position in a Russian-dominated maritime domain. You need to see exactly how this plays out. The Montreux Convention, signed in 1936, granted Turkey control over the Bosporus and Dardanelles Straits connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. The convention limits the tonnage and duration that non-Black Sea nation warships can operate in these waters, effectively giving Turkey veto power over naval access. For 88 years, this treaty represented Turkey's most valuable strategic asset. A nation controlling the only maritime gateway to a sea bordered by 6 countries possesses leverage that transcends its own military capabilities. Turkey used this leverage to balance relationships with Russia, NATO, Ukraine, and regional powers, extracting economic concessions and political influence from all sides. That leverage just evaporated. Russia's deployment demonstrates that controlling the straits matters only if you can prevent a power that already operates inside the Black Sea from establishing permanent dominance of the maritime space. Turkey controls the front door, but Russia now controls the house. The Montreux Convention gives Turkey authority to regulate passage through the straits during peacetime, but provides no mechanism for Turkey to expel or restrict naval forces that belong to Black Sea littoral states operating in international waters. Russia, with its Crimean Peninsula bases and extensive coastline, qualifies as a Black Sea state under international law. Turkey can stop additional Russian vessels from entering, but cannot force existing Russian naval assets to leave. The strategic calculus becomes brutally simple. Russia maintains a permanent Black Sea fleet home-ported in Sevastopol, Crimea. Even if Turkey closed the straits to all Russian naval traffic tomorrow, Moscow already possesses sufficient forces inside the Black Sea to maintain maritime dominance indefinitely. The submarines Russia deployed can operate for 45 days without surfacing. The frigates carry enough fuel for 4,850 nautical miles of cruising. The landing ship can sustain operations for 30 days without resupply. Closing the straits would inconvenience Russian operations but would not end them. Turkey's most powerful card can no longer win the hand. What makes this development truly extraordinary is the timing. Russia executed this deployment precisely 18 days after Turkey announced a $23 billion natural gas pipeline agreement with Azerbaijan and the European Union designed to reduce European dependence on Russian energy. That pipeline, called the Trans-Anatolian Natural Gas Pipeline Expansion, would transport 31 billion cubic meters annually from Azerbaijani fields through Turkey to European markets, directly competing with Russian gas exports. Turkey positioned this agreement as proof of its continuing strategic value to European energy security. Russia responded by demonstrating that Turkey's geographic position matters only if Turkey possesses the military capability to defend it. The naval mathematics support Russia's confidence. Turkey operates 16 frigates and 8 corvettes in its entire naval inventory. Not all of these vessels can deploy simultaneously. Standard naval readiness models suggest that at any given moment, approximately 40% of a fleet is in port for maintenance, another 20% is in training rotations, and only 40% is available for immediate deployment. This means Turkey can likely maintain continuous presence of 6 to 7 major surface combatants in the Black Sea. Russia just deployed a formation that matches this force level while maintaining additional assets in reserve at Sevastopol. Turkey's submarine force theoretically provides an asymmetric advantage. The Turkish Navy operates 14 submarines, including modern German-built Type 214 boats, with air-independent propulsion systems, allowing them to remain submerged for up to 3 weeks. In purely technical terms, Turkish submarines could threaten Russian surface vessels. But capability is not strategy, and strategy is not will. Deploying submarines in an offensive posture against Russian vessels operating in international waters would constitute an act of war that Turkey has demonstrated zero appetite for initiating. Theoretical capability without demonstrated will is indistinguishable from no capability at all. The air dimension reinforces Turkish disadvantage. Russian Su-30SM fighters and Su-24 attack aircraft operate from air bases in Crimea, with flight times to the operational area measured in minutes. Turkey's F-16 fighter fleet, based at Dalaman and Bandırma air bases, faces significantly longer transit times to reach the Black Sea's eastern waters. Russia maintains continuous combat air patrol over its Black Sea fleet formations, using a rotation of 12 aircraft. Turkey could contest this air superiority, but doing so would require committing substantial portions of its air force to what would rapidly escalate into direct military confrontation with a nuclear-armed adversary. No Turkish government will authorize such an escalation over freedom of navigation in international waters, and Moscow knows it. The economic warfare dimension adds another layer of Turkish vulnerability. Russia supplies approximately 33% of Turkey's natural gas and 17% of its crude oil. Annual bilateral trade between Russia and Turkey exceeds $62 billion, making Russia one of Turkey's largest trading partners. More than 7 million Russian tourists visited Turkey in 2023, representing the single largest source of tourism revenue for the Turkish economy. Russia possesses multiple economic pressure points. It can activate simultaneously, reduce natural gas deliveries during winter months, curtail oil exports, forcing Turkey to purchase from more expensive alternative suppliers, impose trade restrictions on Turkish agricultural exports, issue travel advisories reducing tourist flows. Turkey possesses few comparable pressure points against Russia. Turkish construction companies operate projects in Russia valued at approximately $11 billion, which Moscow could seize or suspend. Turkey exports textiles, machinery, and agricultural products to Russia, but these represent replaceable imports for Moscow rather than strategic necessities. The economic relationship is asymmetric, giving Russia far more coercive leverage than Ankara can muster in response. This brings us to the most critical dimension that most analysis is completely missing. Turkey is trapped between incompatible commitments that this Russian deployment forces into direct collision. As a NATO member since 1952, Turkey theoretically enjoys the protection of Article 5 collective defense guarantees. NATO's entire strategic posture in the Black Sea region depends on Turkish cooperation. Allied forces cannot access the Black Sea without transiting Turkish straits. NATO surveillance aircraft operate from Turkish bases. The alliance's southern flank strategy assumes Turkish alignment with Western security interests. Simultaneously, Turkey maintains a relationship with Russia that other NATO members view with deep suspicion but tolerate because they have no alternative. Turkey refused to join Western sanctions against Russia following the Ukraine invasion. Turkey continues purchasing Russian weapon systems, including S-400 air defense missiles that are incompatible with NATO integrated air defense networks. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan maintains regular communication with Russian President Vladimir Putin at a frequency that exceeds his engagement with many NATO counterparts. Turkey has positioned itself as a mediator between Russia and Ukraine, a role that requires maintaining working relationships with both sides, even as they engage in active combat. Russia's Black Sea deployment fractures this balancing act. If Turkey responds to the Russian naval presence with aggressive countermeasures, it risks economic retaliation, energy supply disruptions, and potential military escalation with a nuclear power. If Turkey acquiesces to Russian dominance of Black Sea waters, it signals to NATO allies that Ankara prioritizes its relationship with Moscow over alliance solidarity, potentially triggering questions about Turkey's reliability as a NATO member. There is no middle path that satisfies both requirements. The historical parallel that keeps appearing in strategic assessments is the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. That confrontation involved a smaller power, Cuba, hosting the military capabilities of a superpower, the Soviet Union, in a location where the United States possessed overwhelming regional military superiority, but faced nuclear escalation risks that prevented straightforward application of conventional force. The resolution came through diplomatic negotiation that gave both sides face-saving concessions while establishing clear red lines about future behavior. The Black Sea situation inverts this dynamic. Turkey is the smaller power, but unlike Cuba, Turkey is not hosting Russian capabilities. Russia is projecting its own power from its own territory, using forces that have permanent basing rights on Black Sea coastlines. The United States does not possess overwhelming regional military superiority in the Black Sea, because it is not a literal state and cannot deploy major naval forces without Turkish permission under the Montreux Convention. The nuclear escalation risk is present, but it favors Russia rather than constraining Russia, because any NATO military response to Russian Black Sea operations would occur in Russia's immediate periphery, where Moscow maintains escalation dominance. China's role in this crisis reveals how great power competition operates through proxy conflicts in regional theaters. Beijing has maintained careful neutrality regarding the Ukraine conflict while increasing economic engagement with both Russia and Turkey. Chinese trade with Russia reached $240 billion in 2023, making China Russia's largest trading partner. Simultaneously, China is Turkey's third largest source of imports and a critical partner in Turkey's Belt and Road Initiative participation. Chinese construction companies are building Turkey's first nuclear power plant in a $20 billion project. China benefits regardless of how the Black Sea crisis resolves. If Russia establishes durable control over these waters, it demonstrates that regional powers can challenge U.S.-led alliance structures in their immediate peripheries, creating a precedent that Beijing can cite regarding Taiwan and the South China Sea. If the crisis escalates into prolonged confrontation between Russia and NATO member Turkey, it divides and distracts Western attention from Indo-Pacific competition. If Turkey shifts further toward accommodation with Russia, it weakens NATO cohesion and creates opportunities for Chinese influence in a strategically located NATO member state. Beijing is positioned to gain from every possible outcome, which is why Chinese diplomatic statements about the crisis emphasize respect for sovereignty and international law, without taking any position that would commit China to support either side. The Iran factor adds yet another complication that analysts watching from afar frequently underestimate. Iran and Russia have deepened military cooperation dramatically over the past 18 months, with Iran supplying Shahed 136 attack drones that Russia uses extensively in Ukraine, and Russia providing advanced military technology, including fighter aircraft and air defense systems in return. Iran views the Black Sea as a secondary theater of competition with the United States and its regional allies, using Russian military success in this domain as evidence that American power projection capabilities are declining. Iranian strategic calculations about the Strait of Hormuz and Persian Gulf connect directly to Russian actions in the Black Sea. If Russia can establish area denial dominance in a maritime region adjacent to NATO territory without triggering effective Western military response, Iran gains confidence that similar strategies in the Persian Gulf might succeed. Both Russia and Iran are testing the proposition that regional powers with sufficient anti-access area denial capabilities can create maritime exclusion zones in their peripheries that the United States and its allies will find too costly to challenge. The Black Sea becomes a proof of concept for strategies that could replicate elsewhere. European energy security calculations are being recalibrated in real time as traders and policymakers absorb the implications of Russian Black Sea control. The European Union has spent the past 2 years attempting to diversify energy supplies away from Russian dependence, investing over $300 billion in alternative infrastructure, including liquefied natural gas import terminals, renewable energy expansion, and pipeline connections to non-Russian suppliers. These efforts reduced Russian natural gas's share of European imports from 40% before the Ukraine conflict to 15% currently. But the Black Sea transit routes matter for more than just Russian energy exports. Azerbaijan supplies natural gas to Europe through pipelines that cross beneath the Black Sea. Kazakhstan exports crude oil through Black Sea ports. Ukrainian grain exports, critical for global food security and European supply chains, flow through Black Sea shipping lanes. Russian ability to threaten or disrupt these routes without formally blockading them creates persistent risk premiums that increase costs even when actual disruptions do not occur. Insurance rates for vessels transiting the Black Sea have already increased by 47% in the 36 hours since the Russian deployment. The grain export situation deserves particular attention because it connects Black Sea maritime control directly to global food security and humanitarian concerns. Ukraine is the world's 5th largest wheat exporter and 4th largest corn exporter, with over 90% of these exports flowing through Black Sea ports. Russia's July 2023 withdrawal from the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which had allowed safe passage for Ukrainian agricultural exports despite the ongoing conflict, already created global wheat price volatility. Russian naval dominance of the Black Sea reinforces Moscow's ability to threaten Ukrainian exports at will, giving Russia leverage over global food markets that extends far beyond Europe. The United States finds itself in a strategic bind that this Black Sea deployment exploits with precision. Washington cannot credibly threaten military intervention because U.S. naval forces cannot access the Black Sea in meaningful numbers without Turkish cooperation, and Turkey has every incentive to deny such access to avoid direct Russian-American military confrontation in its immediate vicinity. Economic sanctions against Russia are already at near maximum levels following the Ukraine invasion, leaving few additional pressure points to activate in response to Black Sea naval deployments. Diplomatic condemnation changes nothing about the military facts on the water. American credibility with NATO allies hangs on Washington's ability to demonstrate that alliance commitments mean something when tested. If a NATO member state faces coercive pressure from an adversary, and the United States offers only rhetorical support, it raises questions about what Article 5 security guarantees actually mean in practice. But attempting to provide military support to Turkey in this scenario risks escalation that serves no American strategic interest. The Black Sea is not a vital U.S. interest in the way that the Baltic states or Persian Gulf are. Escalating to confrontation with Russia over freedom of navigation in waters where Russia has legitimate coastal state claims would be strategically irrational. Turkey is calculating its next moves based on an understanding of these constraints. Ankara knows that NATO will support Turkish sovereignty verbally, but will not risk military confrontation with Russia over Turkish freedom of action in international waters. Turkey knows that the European Union needs Turkish cooperation on migration control, energy transit, and regional stability too much to impose meaningful consequences if Turkey accommodates Russian demands. Turkey knows that the United States requires Turkish air bases and intelligence facilities for Middle Eastern operations and cannot afford to alienate Ankara over Black Sea issues. This is the definition of powerlessness. Possessing the knowledge that no ally will bear meaningful costs on your behalf and that your adversary understands this completely. Turkey can protest Russian actions, can deploy its own naval forces to observe Russian movements, can issue statements about sovereignty and international law. None of these actions change the reality that Russia has established maritime control, that Turkey lacks the individual military capability to contest, and lacks the allied support to challenge collectively. The internal Turkish political dimension shapes how Ankara responds to this crisis. President Erdogan faces domestic economic challenges, including 64% inflation, a currency that has lost 44% of its value against the dollar over the past 12 months, and public frustration with declining living standards. The most recent polling shows his approval rating at 43%, down from 52% a year earlier. Erdogan's political survival strategy has historically relied on nationalist rhetoric and demonstrations of Turkish strength on the international stage.